There is a moment, somewhere deep in the history of Rome, that changes everything. It is not the crossing of the Rubicon. It is not the fall of Carthage, or the assassination of Julius Caesar, or the last breath of the Republic. It is quieter than all of those. It is a soldier standing in a doorway. He is armored. He is watching. And he answers to no senate, no consul, no law written on stone. He answers only to the man behind him, and, when it suits him, to no one at all. This is the Praetorian Guard, and for 3 centuries, these men stood at the very center of the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen. To understand the Praetorian Guard is to understand something uncomfortable about power, that it is never truly held by the man on the throne. It is held by the men around him, the men in the room, the men with swords. And in Rome, those men wore the white and gold of the Praetorian cohorts, and they understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what they were worth. The emperors understood it too. Some of them never slept soundly because of it. At their height, the Praetorian Guard numbered somewhere between 9,000 and 16,000 men, depending on the era and the emperor's appetite for protection. They were stationed in and around Rome itself, a permanent military presence in a city that was technically forbidden from housing legions within its walls. That exception alone tells you something. Rome had rules. The Praetorians were the exception to the rules. But before we speak of their power, we must speak of their quality, because these were not ceremonial soldiers. They were not men chosen for their height, their uniforms, or the theatrical impression they made at public events. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. The Praetorians were drawn from the finest soldiers in the Roman military, veterans of the legions who had proven themselves in the field, men who had survived campaigns along the Rhine and the Danube, along the sands of North Africa and the brutal mountain passes of the East. To reach the Guard, a soldier had to have already demonstrated something exceptional. Courage was assumed. Skill was assumed. What the selectors were looking for was something rarer, something more difficult to define and more difficult to fake. A recruit to the Praetorian Guard typically came with years of active service already behind him. He had to be a Roman citizen, a requirement that separated him from the broader auxiliary forces drawn from conquered peoples. He trained in advanced infantry tactics, close quarters combat, and the particular discipline of personal protection, a different art from open battle, requiring a simultaneous awareness of threat, crowd, terrain, and principle at all times. They were skilled horsemen. They were proficient with the gladius, the pilum, and the shield, but also with a longer sword, the spatha, better suited to the close corridors of palace life. They drilled constantly. Even in peacetime, the Praetorian Guard did not grow soft. Their barracks, the Castra Praetoria, built under the reign of Tiberius by the shrewd prefect Sejanus, sat on the northeastern edge of Rome like a city within a city. 12,000 men, walls, granaries, armories. It was not a barracks, it was a statement, and their pay reflected their status. Praetorian soldiers earned 3 times the standard legionary wage, sometimes more. They served shorter terms. They received larger bonuses. The gap between a Praetorian and an ordinary legionary was not merely professional. It was a social gulf. To the men of the outer legions, freezing in Germanic forests or sweating in Egyptian garrisons, the Praetorians were something between an elite and an aristocracy. To the citizens of Rome, they were a constant, visible reminder of imperial authority. Armored figures moving through the city's streets, present at the games, present at the Senate, present wherever the emperor was present. But here is what history remembers most about these men, and what makes them unlike any bodyguard force before or since. They did not simply protect emperors. They chose them. They removed them. They sold the purple to the highest bidder, and they drove daggers into the backs of men they had sworn to protect. In the span of Rome's imperial history, the Praetorian Guard was directly responsible for the assassination of at least a dozen emperors, the installation of several more, and one of the most extraordinary events in Roman history, a public auction in which the throne of the world's greatest empire went to the man who promised the Guard the largest bonus. Power in Rome was always a negotiation, and the Praetorians always had a seat at the table. This is their story. Every great institution begins with a need, and in the autumn of 27 BC, as Gaius Octavius Thurinus, now styled Augustus, the revered one, surveyed the world he had just finished conquering, his need was painfully, urgently clear. He needed to not be murdered. This was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a reasonable professional concern. Julius Caesar, his great-uncle and political father, had been stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate by men he had considered allies. The civil wars that followed had consumed a generation of Romans. Mark Antony was dead. Lepidus was broken. The Republic, that grand and ancient fiction, had been quietly retired, and now Augustus stood alone at the summit of the Roman world, the first man, the princeps, answerable to no one, which meant, in practical terms, that everyone with ambition, grievance, or ideology had only one obstacle standing between themselves and absolute power. That obstacle was Augustus, and Augustus intended to remain an obstacle for a very long time. The solution he reached for was not new. Roman generals had long maintained personal cohorts, small units of trusted soldiers who accompanied them in the field, guarded their tents at night, and stood close during battle. These were called the cohorts Praetorii, a name derived from the Praetorium, the general's headquarters within a military camp. The concept was military, functional, and completely unremarkable. What Augustus did was take that unremarkable concept and transform it into something Rome had never seen before. A permanent, professional, privileged corps of soldiers whose sole purpose was the protection and, quietly, the enforcement of imperial will. He organized them initially into 9 cohorts, each of roughly 500 men. He was careful, at first, about how visible he made them. Augustus was a political genius, above all things, and he understood that Rome in 27 BC was still a city of deep republican sentiment. Men remembered the old ways, they mourned the old freedoms, or at least performed mourning convincingly. Stationing thousands of heavily armed soldiers in the capital would have carried an unmistakable message that the new order was a military dictatorship, whatever polite language surrounded it. Augustus did not want to send that message directly. He preferred the oblique approach, so he distributed most of the Praetorian cohorts across the towns surrounding Rome, rotating them through the city in smaller numbers, keeping their presence felt but not overwhelming. 3 cohorts at a time might be stationed within Rome itself. The others waited nearby, close enough to matter, distant enough not to alarm. It was a careful balance, and it reflected Augustus's extraordinary talent for reshaping reality while maintaining the appearance of tradition. Within Rome, the Praetorians on duty dressed in civilian clothing, togas rather than armor, their weapons concealed. They moved through the city as citizens might, and yet they were always present, always watching, always only moments away from becoming something considerably more dangerous. This undercover quality gave them an almost spectral authority. You could not always see the Praetorian Guard. That, in many ways, made them more frightening than if they had marched openly through every street. The command structure Augustus built was equally deliberate. He placed the guard under the authority of a prefect, the praefectus praetorio, rather than a senator or a magistrate. This was crucial. The senatorial class was the old aristocracy of the Republic, men with their own ambitions, their own networks, their own historical claims to power. Handing them command of his personal army would have been an act of profound foolishness. Instead, Augustus drew his prefects from the equestrian order, the class of wealthy Roman businessmen and administrators who sat just below the senatorial rank, capable, educated, loyal through self-interest rather than ideology. These men owed everything to the emperor. Their elevation, their prestige, their very position in Roman society existed because the emperor willed it. That created a bond more reliable than affection. He appointed 2 prefects simultaneously rather than one, another piece of characteristic Augustan cunning. 2 men sharing power watch each other as much as they watch outward threats. Neither could conspire without the other knowing. Neither could accumulate unchecked loyalty from the troops without his colleague noticing. It was a system designed to neutralize the very dangers it created, a self-correcting mechanism built into the institution's foundations. The pay Augustus established for Praetorian service was transformative. An ordinary legionary on the frontiers earned approximately 225 denarii per year during the early Imperial period. A Praetorian Guardsman earned 375, and that figure would climb over time. Beyond base pay, Praetorians received donatives, cash bonuses distributed at key imperial moments, accessions, victories, anniversaries. That could equal years of a legionary's salary in a single payment. The message this sent, both to the guard and to the wider military, was impossible to misread. These men were valued above all others. Their loyalty was worth purchasing at premium rates. And that logic, once established, would prove very difficult to contain. Service terms were set at 12 years for the Praetorians, compared to 20 or 25 for ordinary legions. Upon honorable discharge, a Praetorian received a retirement bonus of 5,000 denarii, a sum substantial enough to establish a man comfortably in civilian life, to buy land, to open a business, to become a figure of local consequence wherever he settled. Service in the Guard was not merely a prestigious posting. It was a path to prosperity, a mechanism of social advancement available to men who began with nothing but physical courage and military talent, and the men selected were, without exception, expected to bring both in abundance. The recruitment process under Augustus favored Italians, a policy that reflected the emperor's desire to keep the Guard culturally and linguistically close to Rome itself. These were men who understood Roman values, spoke Latin as their mother tongue, and had grown up within the orbit of Roman civic life. In the earliest years of the Guard, recruits were drawn almost exclusively from Italy, Noricum, Macedonia, and the Spanish provinces, regions with deep Roman roots and long traditions of military service. A recruit needed to be a free-born Roman citizen in good physical condition, of sound character, and with references that could be verified. He would have typically served in the legions long enough to demonstrate his qualities, though the precise requirements shifted from emperor to emperor. Once selected, a new Praetorian entered a world apart from anything ordinary military life had offered him. The training was relentless and comprehensive. The close-quarters disciplines required for personal protection are distinct from the tactics of the open battlefield, and the Guard trained accordingly. A legionary in the field needed to function within a formation, to hold his place in a line, to push and press and endure as part of a collective body. A Praetorian needed all of that, and more. He needed to read a crowd. He needed to identify a threat before it became an attack. He needed to operate in confined spaces, in corridors and doorways and banquet halls and public forums, where the ordered geometry of battlefield tactics was useless, and individual skill, awareness, and decisiveness were everything. They were trained in multiple weapons systems. The standard legionary equipment of gladius and scutum, the short sword, and the large rectangular shield, remained foundational. But Praetorians also developed proficiency with the longer cavalry sword, with the javelin, with the bow. They trained on horseback. They maintained physical conditioning regimens that would have challenged men half their age. Even the Praetorians stationed at the Castra Praetoria, apparently comfortable in their permanent barracks within the capital, drilled with a regularity and seriousness that distinguished them from garrison troops elsewhere in the empire. Their armor reflected their elevated status. Praetorian ceremonial dress was among the most striking in the Roman military world, and we know its appearance from numerous surviving sculptures and reliefs, most famously the Praetorian relief now held in the Louvre, carved in the 1st century and depicting guardsmen in elaborate muscle cuirasses, crested helmets, and decorated shields bearing the scorpion, the astrological sign of Augustus's successor Tiberius, and the thunderbolt of Jupiter. These were not purely ornamental. The quality of materials in Praetorian equipment exceeded standard issue across every category. Better iron, better leather, better craftsmanship. In battle, as in ceremony, the Guard were meant to look like what they were, the finest soldiers Rome produced. Augustus lived for 45 years after founding the Guard. He died in AD 14 in his bed in the town of Nola with his wife Livia at his side. By the standards of Roman emperors, this was a remarkably peaceful exit. Whether the Guard deserves any credit for that longevity is impossible to say with certainty, though the argument is easy to make. For 45 years, the institution he had built surrounded him, traveled with him, watched the doors of every room he slept in, and tasted, at least by rumor, the food set before him. For 45 years, no senator's dagger found him, no rival general's ambition consumed him, no mob's fury overwhelmed him. He died, an old man. In Rome, in the 1st century, that was an achievement of the First Order. But Augustus had done something more than protect himself. He had created an institution with its own momentum, its own culture, its own appetite. He had placed 12,000 armed men in and around the capital, paid them better than any soldiers in the world, given them status and privilege and the intoxicating proximity to absolute power, and then bound them to a system that was, in the end, only as stable as the man at its center. When that man was gone, the question the Guard had always quietly contained would finally begin to surface. If we make emperors, the soldiers would one day ask each other in the fire-lit quiet of the Castra Praetoria, what prevents us from unmaking them? The answer, as Rome was about to discover, was very little. Power, in any system, flows toward those who control access to it. This is not a modern observation. It is not a cynical one. It is simply a fact about human organizations that the Romans understood intuitively, and that the history of the Praetorian Guard illustrates more vividly than perhaps any other example in the ancient world. The emperor sat on the throne. The Praetorian prefect stood between the emperor and everyone else, and in the right hands, that position, that single point of access, could become something nearly indistinguishable from power itself. No one understood this more completely than Lucius alias Sejanus. To understand Sejanus, you must first understand the emperor he served, because the two men were, in many ways, a perfect and terrible fit for each other. Tiberius Julius Caesar. Augustus was the stepson and chosen successor of Augustus, a man who had spent decades in the shadow of his brilliant predecessor before ascending to the throne in AD 14. He was intelligent, deeply so, and experienced as both a general and an administrator. He was also profoundly suspicious, emotionally withdrawn, and increasingly convinced as his reign progressed that the world around him was populated by flatterers, schemers, and enemies waiting for their moment. He did not enjoy Rome. He did not enjoy the Senate. He did not, by most accounts, particularly enjoy being emperor, though he accepted the role with the grim dutifulness that characterized almost everything he did. What Tiberius wanted more than almost anything, was to be left alone. Sejanus sensed this the way a gifted predator senses vulnerability. Not with malice at the outset, perhaps, but with the animal precision of a man who had spent his entire life reading rooms and understanding what each room required of him. He had been born into the equestrian order, the son of a prefect, and he had moved through the early stages of his career with a smoothness that suggested both talent and a very clear sense of destination. By the time Tiberius came to power, Sejanus was already co-prefect of the Praetorian Guard, alongside his father, Lucius Caius Strabo, when Strabo was shortly afterward appointed prefect of Egypt, a prestigious posting that nonetheless removed him from Rome. Sejanus found himself sole commander of the most powerful military force in the capital. He was in his early 30s. He had, functionally, just inherited the keys to the empire. What he did next was methodical, patient, and extraordinarily effective. The first and most consequential act of Sejanus as sole prefect was the construction of the Castra Praetoria, the permanent barracks complex on the Viminal Hill at the northeastern edge of Rome. Before this, as Augustus had designed it, the Praetorian cohorts were dispersed across Rome and the surrounding region, distributed and diluted, their collective power deliberately fragmented. Sejanus argued to Tiberius, persuasively, that this arrangement was inefficient. A unified barracks would improve discipline, streamline logistics, and allow for faster response to any threat. All of this was true. What Sejanus did not emphasize was the other thing that a unified barracks would produce: a concentrated force of 12,000 men, living together, training together, developing a collective identity and loyalty that would flow not to the abstract institution of Rome, or even to the distant emperor, but to the man they saw every day, the man who paid them, promoted them, and stood at their head. The Castra Praetoria was completed around AD 23. From that point forward, Sejanus held in his hand something no Praetorian prefect before him had possessed: a standing army within the walls of Rome, loyal to him personally, answerable first to his command. Tiberius, to his eventual catastrophic cost, trusted him completely. The relationship between the two men became the defining political axis of the early Tiberian reign. Sejanus was charming where Tiberius was cold. He was sociable where the emperor was reclusive. He managed the endless human machinery of Roman political life, the senators seeking audiences, the generals seeking commissions, the petitioners and supplicants and informers who formed the daily texture of imperial administration, with an ease that Tiberius found genuinely useful, and privately, perhaps, a little relieving. If Sejanus handled people, Tiberius could handle ideas and policy, which he was considerably more comfortable with. It was a division of labor that suited both men, but it also meant that Sejanus became, by degrees, the gatekeeper of the empire. Access to Tiberius ran through him. Appointments ran through him. Information, what the emperor heard, what he was told, what version of events reached him, ran through him. Roman historians, writing afterward, would describe how Sejanus cultivated informers, built networks of clients and dependents throughout the city, and used the treason laws, the infamous maestas charges, as weapons against men he considered rivals or obstacles. A word from Sejanus to the right informer could end a career, exile a family, or produce a death sentence. The city grew fearful. Men watched what they said in public and what they whispered in private. In an environment of pervasive suspicion, the man who controlled information controlled everything. His ambitions, as they clarified over the years, were staggering in their scope. Sejanus wished to be emperor, not prefect, not the power behind the throne, but emperor himself. The purple, the divine honors, the succession. This was not a casual fantasy. He pursued it as a long-range, strategic objective, dismantling obstacles with the patience of a man who understood that in Roman politics, timing was as important as intention. He worked to eliminate the natural successors to Tiberius, the members of the Julio-Claudian family, who stood between himself and the inheritance he desired. Germanicus, the popular and beloved general who had been the most obvious future emperor, died in AD 19 under circumstances that were suspicious at the time and remain murky still. Sejanus was not proven responsible, but the suspicion adhered to him and has never entirely dissolved in the historical record. Agrippina the Elder, Germanicus's formidable widow, became a target of deliberate persecution, her allies stripped away, her reputation attacked, until she was eventually exiled and died. By starvation, it was said, on the island of Pandateria. Her sons, the grandsons of Augustus, and the most legitimate claimants to the succession, were similarly targeted: Nero Caesar and Drusus Caesar. Not to be confused with Tiberius's own son Drusus, who had died in AD 23, were accused of treason and destroyed. The field of succession was being methodically cleared. Then Sejanus moved toward the ultimate prize. He requested permission from Tiberius to marry Livilla, the widow of the emperor's own son Drusus. The marriage would have made him a member of the imperial family, no longer merely the servant of power, but its legitimate heir. Tiberius initially refused, then wavered, then appeared to relent. The Roman world watched and understood perfectly what was happening. Men who had cultivated the friendship of Sejanus intensified their efforts. Men who had made enemies of him contemplated exile, or worse. And then, in AD 31, everything ended. What precisely turned Tiberius against Sejanus remains one of the great mysteries of Roman political history. The emperor had retreated to his villa on the island of Capri in AD 26 and had not returned to Rome since, conducting the business of empire through correspondence and through Sejanus himself. From this self-imposed isolation, he received at some point in 31 information that shook him deeply enough to act. The most compelling account, preserved by Cassius Dio, involves a letter from Antonia Minor, the mother of the future Emperor Claudius, and a woman of formidable intelligence and impeccable connection, warning Tiberius directly that his prefect was plotting against him. Other accounts implicate a rival at court. The precise mechanism may never be known. What we know is the result. Tiberius orchestrated what followed with a cunning that his years of apparent passivity had obscured. He wrote Sejanus a long, ambiguous letter, flattering and critical by turns, designed to keep his target uncertain and in place. He appointed a new prefect, Naevius Sutorius Macro, in secret, giving him the authority to replace Sejanus and the instructions necessary to carry it out. On October 18, AD 31, Sejanus was summoned to a meeting of the Senate. He arrived expecting, by most accounts, the announcement of honors, tribunician power, perhaps, the formal step toward succession he had been awaiting. Macro handed the commander of the Praetorian Guard at the door a letter from Tiberius, a letter that offered the guardsmen substantial bonuses for their loyalty and reminded them, delicately but unmistakably, where their true obligations lay. Then Macro stepped aside, and the letter to the Senate was read aloud. It was a denunciation, point by point, charge by charge. Tiberius dismantled the man he had called his partner, his fellow soldier, the dearest of men. Sejanus sat in the chamber and listened to his own destruction being read to him in the emperor's words. The senators, who had spent years competing for his favor, turned on him with the practiced speed of men who had survived Roman politics long enough to know which way the wind was blowing. He was arrested before he left the building. He was executed that same day, strangled in the Mamertine prison, and his body was thrown to the mob, who tore it apart in the streets. His children were killed. His ex-wife revealed, in a letter she wrote before her own death, that Sejanus had poisoned Tiberius's son Drusus years before, a revelation that plunged the aged emperor into a grief and rage that colored the remainder of his reign. His friends, clients, and associates were pursued through the courts with the same treason laws he had weaponized against others, a savage irony that the Romans of the time noted with a grim appreciation for symmetry. The fall of Sejanus revealed something about the Praetorian Guard that would prove permanently true throughout its history. The Guard's loyalty was not a fixed quantity. It was not a sacred bond, forged once and held forever. It was a dynamic, negotiable thing, responsive to incentive and proximity and self-interest. Macro had arrived at the door with a promise of money and a reminder of who was emperor, and the Guard had stepped aside. The institution served power. The question was always which power. Sejanus had understood this better than anyone, and had spent 15 years building his answer to that question. In the end, it had not been enough. Tiberius, reclusive and aging on his island, had proven wilier than his prefect had calculated. The old emperor had waited, gathered information, and acted at precisely the right moment, with precisely the right leverage. But what Tiberius could not undo was the lesson Sejanus had taught. He had demonstrated, in exhaustive and catastrophic detail, exactly how much could be achieved from the position of Praetorian prefect by a man willing to play the long game. He had shown the Guard itself what it was capable of, what it was worth, and how completely the fate of the empire could depend on where its swords were pointed. Every ambitious prefect who came after him had been watching. Every one of them remembered. There is a year in Roman history that functions less like a chapter and more like a confession. AD 69, the year of the 4 emperors. In the span of 12 months, Rome watched 4 men wear the purple in succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. And in that procession of rising and falling fortunes, the Praetorian Guard revealed, with a nakedness that left no room for comfortable interpretation, exactly what they had always been. Not protectors, not servants of Rome, not the loyal shield of a legitimate dynasty. They were kingmakers operating in an open market, and the commodity they traded was the most valuable in the world. But to understand AD 69, you must first understand the man whose death made it possible. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the last of the Julio-Claudian line, had spent his reign careening between genuine artistic sensibility and catastrophic governance, between moments of surprising administrative competence and acts of such spectacular cruelty that even Rome, a city not easily shocked, recoiled. He had murdered his mother. He had kicked his pregnant wife to death. He had burned Christians as human torches in his gardens, and then, with a certain performative generosity, opened those same gardens to the public. He had declared himself a god and a poet of the first rank, and had compelled audiences to sit through his theatrical performances on pain of imperial displeasure. A story survives, possibly apocryphal but too perfectly Roman to discard entirely, that men feigned death to escape his recitals. By AD 68, the empire was fracturing. Governors in Gaul and Spain had declared against him. The Senate, that ancient body which had survived Caligula and Claudius and Sejanus and was constitutionally incapable of decisive action, nonetheless found the courage to declare Nero a public enemy. The legions were moving, and the Praetorian Guard, the institution whose purpose was literally to keep this man alive, had decided, with the calm financial logic that increasingly governed their decisions, that Nero was no longer a viable investment. The prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, told the Guard that Nero had already fled, and that the Senate intended to reward the Praetorians generously if they transferred their loyalty to the elderly Spanish governor, Servius Sulpicius Galba. The promised bonus was enormous: 30,000 sesterces per man, a figure approaching 4 years of standard salary delivered in a single transaction. The Guard agreed. Nero, abandoned by the men whose entire institutional reason for existence was his protection, fled Rome and died by his own hand in a freedman's villa outside the city, reportedly lamenting that the world was losing a great artist. He was 30 years old. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line that stretched back to Augustus himself, died with him. Galba entered Rome in the autumn of AD 68 as emperor, and he immediately made the kind of mistake that only a man of profound political obtuseness could make in his position. He refused to pay the bonus, 30,000 sesterces per man, promised, expected, earned in the Guard's accounting by the transfer of loyalty that had put Galba on the throne in the first place. And Galba, a man formed by an older and sterner Roman tradition, reportedly responded to the matter with a phrase that Tacitus preserved and that echoes across the centuries for its magnificent misjudgment. He said that he was accustomed to levy soldiers, not to buy them. It was a noble sentiment. It was also a death sentence. The Guard's disillusionment with Galba hardened quickly and was reinforced by his every subsequent action. He was severe where they wanted generosity, cold where they wanted acknowledgement, and he had brought his own Spanish troops to Rome, whose presence the Praetorians interpreted, correctly, as a signal that their privileged position might be subject to revision. Then Galba compounded everything by announcing his chosen successor, not a man the Guard had been consulted about, not a figure who had cultivated their loyalty, but Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, a young aristocrat of impeccable lineage and negligible military experience whom Galba considered a suitable heir, precisely because he was, in the emperor's estimation, virtuous and uncorrupted. This announcement was the final calculation that pushed Marcus Salvius Otho over the edge. Otho was a former friend of Nero's, a polished and sociable man who had expected to be named Galba's successor himself, and had spent the months of Galba's reign cultivating the Praetorian Guard with the targeted generosity that Galba conspicuously refused to practice. He attended their dinners. He learned their names. He distributed gifts from his private fortune with a consistency that communicated, more eloquently than any speech, that he understood what they were worth and intended to demonstrate it. When Galba chose Piso, Otho moved immediately, on January 15th, AD 69, a date that Romans afterward would mark as the beginning of the catastrophe. Otho was escorted by a small group of Praetorian soldiers to the camp of the Guard, where he was proclaimed emperor. The speed with which the rest of the cohorts joined him tells you everything you need to know about the temperature of Praetorian opinion at that moment. Within hours, Galba, Piso, and several of their associates were hunted down through the streets and forums of Rome and killed. The heads of the emperor and his chosen successor were paraded through the city on poles, and the Praetorian Guard presented them to their new emperor with the easy professionalism of men who had concluded a transaction and expected the agreed payment. Otho paid. Whatever else might be said of him, he was not Galba, but Otho's reign lasted only 3 months, ended not by the Guard's treachery, but by the legions of the Rhine, who had their own candidate for the throne, a large, gregarious, spectacularly self-indulgent general named Aulus Vitellius, whose primary qualifications for imperial power were his popularity with his troops and an appetite for eating that Roman historians recorded with an almost admiring disbelief. Vitellius's forces moved south with the disciplined momentum of frontier legions that had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opportunity. Otho's forces, including the Praetorian cohorts who formed the core of his field army, were defeated at the First Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy in April. Otho, in an act that surprised even his critics with its dignity, chose suicide rather than continue a war that would cost Roman lives he no longer felt the prize was worth. He had been emperor for 95 days. Vitellius entered Rome in the summer of AD 69, and his treatment of the Praetorian Guard was the most radical response to the institution's behavior that any emperor had yet attempted. He dismissed them, all of them. The entire Guard, 16 cohorts by this point in the chaos, was discharged. Their places were taken by soldiers drawn from the Germanic legions that had carried Vitellius to power, men whose loyalty was to their general rather than to any tradition of Praetorian privilege. New cohorts were formed, swollen to 1,000 men each, loyal to Vitellius in the direct and uncomplicated way that battlefield comrades are loyal to the commander who led them to victory. It was, in principle, a reasonable solution. Cut out the infected tissue, replace it with something sound. In practice, Vitellius had simply exchanged one problem for another. His Germanic soldiers were formidable in the field, but culturally alien to Rome. Rougher, louder, less disciplined in the ways of city life, and deeply resented by the Roman population who had to live alongside them. The dismissed Praetorians, meanwhile, did not simply go home and plant gardens. They were professional soldiers in the prime of their careers, stripped of status and income, furious and available. They scattered through Italy, and many of them eventually found their way to the forces assembling in the east behind the man who would become the fourth emperor of that extraordinary year, Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Vespasian was the commander of the Judean campaign, a soldier of broad experience and substantial talent who had the additional and considerable advantage of being entirely unlike everyone who had preceded him that year. He was not aristocratic, not beautiful, not particularly elegant. He was a blunt, plain-spoken man of Italian farming stock who had risen entirely through military competence and administrative capability. His humor was earthy, his habits were simple, and by the summer of AD 69, he had the support of the Eastern legions, the Danubian legions, and a growing coalition of governors and generals who had concluded that the Western Empire could not continue consuming emperors at its current rate. The forces loyal to Vespasian moved on Rome. Vitellius negotiated, then fought, then negotiated again, with the diminishing leverage of a man watching his support evaporate. In December of AD 69, his Germanic troops were defeated, and Rome was entered by Vespasian's forces after bitter street fighting that included the burning of the Capitoline Temple. Vitellius was found hiding, reportedly in a doorkeeper's quarters, and was killed in the street by soldiers who did not trouble themselves with ceremony. Vespasian, still in the east, was emperor. What he inherited was a Praetorian Guard that had, within a single year, abandoned one emperor, installed another, fought for a third, been dissolved by a fourth, and now stood reconstituted under yet another command. The institution had been revealed, stripped of every ceremonial dignity, as a political actor of the most nakedly mercenary kind. The year's events had demonstrated its extraordinary power and its fundamental unreliability in the same breath. It could make emperors. It had just made several, but it could not sustain them because its loyalty was indexed not to legitimacy or tradition or Roman virtue, but to the much simpler and much more volatile question of who was winning and what they were offering. Vespasian understood this. He was a practical man, and he made practical adjustments, consolidating the Guard under commanders of proven personal loyalty and working methodically to rebuild the institution's culture around the Flavian dynasty he intended to establish. He was largely successful. His reign lasted 10 years, and he died in his bed, a feat that was becoming, in these years, increasingly remarkable. But the events of AD 69 could not be unremembered. The Guard itself could not unlearn what it had discovered about its own capabilities. The senators and governors and generals of the empire could not unlearn it either. The throne was not sacred. It was not inviolable. It was not beyond reach. It was, under the right circumstances, available. The Praetorian Guard had not merely proven this. They had put it on public display, priced it, and sold it. And the market, once opened, is very difficult to close. There is a passage in the writings of Edward Gibbon, the great 18th century historian of Rome's decline, where he describes the period stretching from the reign of Nerva in AD 96 to the death of Marcus Aurelius in AD 180, as perhaps the period in human history during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. It is a sweeping claim, the kind that historians today approach with considerable caution, but it contains within it a recognizable truth. These were the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, and the near century they governed between them represents something genuinely unusual in Roman history. Competent men, measured men, men who, with varying degrees of success, attempted to rule an empire of 60 million people with something approaching justice and administrative seriousness. And throughout this golden period, the Praetorian Guard stood at the center of Roman life, performing its function with a professionalism and relative restraint that allowed the institution to recover much of the dignity that the catastrophic year of AD 69 had stripped from it. The Guard, under the 5 good emperors, did not murder its principles. It did not auction the purple or negotiate terms with rival claimants. It accompanied the emperors on campaign, Trajan to Dacia and Parthia, Hadrian across the breadth of the empire on his extraordinary personal inspections, Marcus Aurelius to the frozen misery of the Danubian frontier. And it fought with a skill and ferocity that validated, in military terms, every privilege it had ever been granted. But institutions do not merely reflect their best moments. They accumulate habits, expectations, and internal cultures that persist long after the circumstances that shaped them have changed. And beneath the orderly surface of the Antonine Golden Age, the Praetorian Guard was developing characteristics that would, given the right conditions, prove as dangerous as anything Sejanus or the chaos of AD 69 had produced. To understand this, you must understand what a century of privilege does to a military institution. The Praetorian Guard of the mid-2nd century was, in terms of its daily experience, almost unrecognizably comfortable compared to the frontier legions of the same period. While soldiers on the Rhine and Danube built their own fortifications in freezing mud, patrolled hundreds of miles of contested border, and fought genuine wars against enemies who gave no quarter, the Praetorians in Rome occupied permanent, well-appointed barracks in the most sophisticated city in the world. They were paid 3 times as much. They trained rigorously, yes, but training in a barracks is a different thing from the hardening that comes from actual sustained campaign life. The occasional military expedition with an emperor was significant, but it was not the continuous operational grind of frontier service. The result, developing gradually and almost invisibly over decades, was an institution of exceptional individual soldiers whose collective character had been subtly shaped by proximity to luxury, politics, and power. The Praetorians of the Antonine period were not soft men, but they were men who had grown accustomed to being the most important soldiers in the world, and that consciousness of their own centrality, their own value, their own negotiating position in the economy of Roman power was baked into the institution at every level. This was most visible in the changing social profile of the Guard's leadership. The Praetorian prefect of the 2nd century was a figure of enormous administrative as well as military significance. Under Hadrian, the prefect Marcius Turbo was essentially a co-administrator of empire, handling correspondence, judicial functions, and strategic planning at a level that blurred the boundaries between military command and civilian government. The great jurist Papinian served as prefect under Septimius Severus, a man whose legal scholarship was so formidable that it continued to shape Roman law for centuries after his death. These were not merely soldiers. They were among the most capable administrators in the empire, and their office had become a position of genuine governing power. The implications of this evolution were double-edged. On one hand, it meant the Guard was commanded by men of sophistication and ability who could manage the institution's considerable political weight with judgment and restraint. On the other hand, it meant that the prefectship had become a prize of the first magnitude, attracting men of the highest ambition, men for whom the office was not a destination but a platform. And then there is the matter of Commodus, Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, stoic, author of the Meditations, perhaps the most intellectually serious man ever to hold the Roman purple. made one catastrophic personal decision in an otherwise remarkably considered life. He allowed his biological son Commodus to succeed him, abandoning the adoptive succession that had produced the 5 good emperors, reverting to the dynastic principle that had given Rome Caligula and Nero. It is the great tragic irony of his reign, the single crack in the most carefully constructed imperial edifice Rome ever produced. Commodus was 17 when he became co-emperor with his father in AD 177, and 20 when Marcus died and left him sole ruler. He was physically magnificent, an athlete of genuine ability who devoted himself to the arena with an enthusiasm that the Roman aristocracy found first embarrassing, then alarming, then simply dangerous. He fought in the gladiatorial arena personally hundreds of times, by the ancient accounts, dressed as Hercules, killing exotic animals with a theatrical relish that drew enormous crowds while simultaneously horrifying the senatorial class that was supposed to be governing the empire alongside him. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules and demanded to be worshipped accordingly. He was also genuinely dangerous in a more direct sense. His suspicion of those around him, never well managed, deepened over time into something approaching clinical paranoia. He had men executed on thin pretexts or no pretexts. He maintained a court atmosphere of terror that senators navigated with the exhausting vigilance of men who knew that any day might bring a charge of treason delivered without warning or recourse. The Praetorian Guard, under Commodus, occupied a peculiar position. On one level, they were closer to the center of power than ever, performing their ceremonial and protective functions around an emperor whose personal security obsessions kept them constantly busy. On another level, they were participants in a court that was becoming increasingly irrational and increasingly lethal for anyone who came near it. 2 prefects of the guard, Perennis and then Cleander, rose to dominate the administration during different periods of Commodus's reign, each accumulating the kind of concentrated personal power that recalled Sejanus, and each meeting an end that recalled him too. Perennis killed on Commodus's orders after being accused by a delegation of mutinous British soldiers, Cleander torn apart by a Roman mob and his head displayed on a pole. The guard watched these prefects rise and fall. They watched the emperor perform his fantasies in the arena, and they absorbed, gradually and collectively, the lesson that was being demonstrated before them with increasing clarity, that this emperor was not sustainable, that his reign was a fire that was consuming everything around it, and that the institution which had survived every crisis Rome had produced for the past 2.5 centuries was going to have to make a decision. The conspiracy that formed against Commodus in AD 192 was remarkable for the breadth of its participation. His mistress Marcia was involved. His chamberlain Eclectus was involved, and the Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Laetus was at the center of it. This was the guard, not acting from the mercenary logic of AD 69, not maneuvering for bonuses or reacting to broken promises, but making something closer to a political judgment, that the emperor they were sworn to protect had become a threat not merely to individuals around him, but to the stability of the Roman system itself. On the night of December 31st, AD 192, Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, hired for the purpose after an earlier attempt with poison had failed to produce the desired result. The Praetorian Guard, under Laetus's direction, had selected a successor before the deed was done. Publius Helvius Pertinax, an experienced administrator and former general, respected and competent, a man who represented exactly the kind of sober, serious governance that the Commodus nightmare had made everyone hunger for. Pertinax lasted 86 days. His crime, like Galba's a century and more before him, was attempting to restore discipline and fiscal seriousness to an institution that had spent the preceding decades treating its privileges as permanent entitlements. He cut expenses. He reduced donatives. He made it clear that the relationship between emperor and guard was going to be renegotiated on terms more favorable to the concept of actual governance. The Guard responded in March of AD 193 with the straightforward brutality that the institution was capable of when its patience ran out. A group of roughly 300 Praetorians marched to the palace. Pertinax came out to meet them and spoke to them with a calm dignity that the ancient sources record with something approaching admiration. It did not help him. He was killed where he stood, his head removed and carried back to the Praetorian camp on a lance. What happened next transcended even the shocking auction block logic of AD 69. The Guard literally put the Imperial throne up for public bid. Heralds announced from the walls of the Castra Praetoria that the position of Emperor of Rome was available to the man who offered the largest bonus per soldier. Two men presented themselves as bidders. Titus Flavius Claudius Sulpicianus, the father-in-law of the murdered Pertinax, was already inside the camp making his offer when Marcus Didius Julianus arrived at the gates and began shouting his competing bid to the soldiers on the walls. The two men bid upward against each other in increments, while the Guard deliberated with the calm commercial seriousness of men conducting an ordinary market transaction. Julianus won. He offered 25,000 sesterces per man, a figure that exceeded even the spectacular promises of AD 69. The gates opened. He was taken inside. Acclaimed emperor escorted to the Senate, which confirmed his position with the reliable alacrity of a body that had learned the cost of hesitation and installed in the palace. He had purchased the Roman Empire. He held it for 66 days. The frontier legions, hearing what had occurred, reacted with the outrage of men who had spent their careers in genuine hardship, while the Praetorians luxuriated in Rome, and who now discovered that the institution they had always resented had sold the empire to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock at a provincial market. 3 separate candidates were acclaimed by different frontier armies simultaneously, and the resulting civil war was brief only because one of the candidates, Septimius Severus, moved faster and more decisively than his rivals. He marched on Rome with his Danubian legions before any effective resistance could be organized. The Senate condemned Julianus. Julianus was executed in the palace, killed by a soldier while attempting to understand, reportedly, what he had done to deserve this outcome. He had been emperor for approximately 9 weeks. He had paid more for the position than any man in history. Septimius Severus entered Rome and did something no emperor before him had quite managed. He summoned the Praetorian Guard in full ceremonial dress to a formal assembly outside the city and then, surrounded by his own vastly larger army, disbanded them entirely. Every man discharged, forbidden from coming within 100 miles of Rome, stripped of their arms and their rank and their accumulated privileges in a single afternoon. It was humiliation delivered at sword point, precise and deliberate, and it was witnessed by the soldiers of the Danubian legions who had marched Severus to power, soldiers who had spent careers on the frozen frontier watching the Praetorians collect triple pay for standing in the warmth of Rome. He then rebuilt the Guard from his own loyal troops, expanding it and restructuring its composition to include soldiers from the provincial legions rather than exclusively from Italy. The old Guard, with its particular culture and its particular sense of entitlement, was gone. But the institution remained. The position remained. The proximity to power remained. And with it, inevitably, remained the question that had haunted Rome since the first Praetorian cohort stood watch outside Augustus's door. Who guards the guardians? Rome had been asking this question for 2 centuries and had never found a satisfactory answer. It would spend the next century discovering that some questions, once embedded in the structure of a civilization, cannot be answered. They can only be outlasted. There is a particular kind of ending that does not arrive all at once. It does not come with a single dramatic moment, a clean break, a date that historians can circle on a calendar and point to as the precise instant when everything changed. Instead, It comes the way a great building deteriorates, slowly, then suddenly, with years of invisible structural decay, preceding the collapse that everyone afterward describes as unexpected. The end of the Praetorian Guard was that kind of ending. It was preceded by a century of mounting irrelevance, of institutional identity crisis, of an organization that had been built for one world, finding itself stranded in a world it no longer recognized and could no longer control. That world was the 3rd century, and the 3rd century was Rome at its most brutal, its most unstable, its most honest about the violent realities that the golden age of the Antonines had temporarily obscured. Between AD 2035 and AD 284, Rome cycled through approximately 50 emperors, depending on how generously one counts the various usurpers, co-emperors, and claimants who rose and fell across that catastrophic half-century. Many of them reigned for months, some for weeks. The average tenure of an emperor in this period, calculated with the cold arithmetic of historical retrospect, was roughly 2 years, and the overwhelming majority of those men did not die peacefully. They were killed by their own troops, by rivals, by the soldiers who had just acclaimed them, by the soldiers who had decided to acclaim someone else. The period has a name in the historical literature, the crisis of the 3rd century, and the name is, if anything, an understatement. The Praetorian Guard did not cause this crisis. That requires emphasis, because it is easy, tracing the Guard's history of interference and assassination, to assign them more causal power than they actually possessed in this period. The 3rd century crisis was driven by forces operating at a scale far beyond the capacity of any single institution to manage. The relentless pressure of external enemies on multiple frontiers simultaneously, the catastrophic strains that continuous warfare placed on Roman finances and manpower, the breakdown of legitimate succession mechanisms, the growing power of the frontier armies who had learned from the events of AD 69 and AD 193 that emperors could be made by legions as easily as by the Praetorian Guard, and the plague, the punishing Antonine plague and then the plague of Cyprian, which moved through the empire's population in waves that depressed agricultural product. Against this backdrop, the Praetorian Guard was becoming something it had never been designed to be, a secondary power, one military faction among many, increasingly unable to determine outcomes that the frontier armies decided on campaign fields hundreds of miles from Rome. The Guard could still kill an emperor in the palace. What it could no longer reliably do was decide who the next one would be, because the legions of the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and the African frontier had their own candidates and their own interests and their own willingness to march. The Guard's geographical advantage, its physical proximity to Rome and therefore to the moment of succession, was increasingly offset by the numerical and operational superiority of the frontier armies, whose loyalty was what actually determined whether an emperor survived contact with the empire's external enemies. This erosion of the Guard's decisive role played out across the 3rd century in ways that were simultaneously dramatic and, from the long perspective of history, almost pathetic. Emperors rose and fell. The Guard acclaimed and abandoned, killed and replaced, with a mechanical regularity that had long since ceased to carry the shock of novelty. Maximinus Thrax, the enormous Thracian soldier who became emperor in AD 235, and who reportedly stood 8 feet tall by the account of sources that were clearly not operating under strict standards of journalistic verification, was the first emperor in Roman history who never visited Rome at all during his reign. He had no interest in the Guard. He had no need of the Guard. He was a creature of the frontier armies, and he governed, brutally and effectively, from the field. His reign established a template that would become increasingly common. The soldier emperor, the barracks emperor, the man who wore the purple because his troops had placed it on him, and who spent his reign marching from one crisis to the next, sustained by military loyalty rather than institutional legitimacy. These men did not need the Praetorian Guard. The Guard's entire political architecture had been built on the assumption that power resided in Rome, that the emperor was a Roman figure governing from the center of a Roman world. As the center weakened and the periphery grew stronger, that assumption crumbled. The Guard made its last serious attempt to function as a king-making institution in AD 238, the extraordinary year of the six emperors, which surpassed even AD 69 for sheer concentrated chaos. In that single year, 6 men held or claimed the imperial title, and the Guard was directly involved in the deaths of several of them, killing the elderly co-emperors Pupienus and Balbinus, men chosen by the Senate with the explicit intention of bypassing Praetorian influence, dragging them through the streets to the camp and murdering them with a casual brutality that suggested an institution performing the motions of power it could feel slipping away. They installed the teenage Gordian III in their place, a boy of 13 whose primary qualification was his relationship to a previous emperor, and whose youth made him, in the Guard's calculation, appropriately manageable. The calculation was not wrong exactly, but it no longer mattered in the way it once would have. Gordian III reigned for 6 years, governed largely through his prefect Timus Tithius, and then through the soldier Philip the Arab, and died on campaign in Persia, in circumstances that Philip almost certainly arranged. The Guard was not consulted. The Guard was not present. The decision was made by an army on the far side of the empire's eastern frontier, and by the time anyone in Rome knew that there was a new emperor, Philip was already on his way back to the capital with the fait accompli completed. This is what institutional decline looks like in practice. Not a dramatic fall, but a gradual exclusion from the decisions that matter, a shrinking of relevance that happens so incrementally that the institution itself is often the last to recognize it. The Guard continued to exist. It continued to be paid, to occupy the Castra Praetoria, to perform its ceremonial functions around whatever emperor happened to be resident in Rome at any given moment. But the old terror it had inspired, the sense that the Praetorian Guard represented a concentrated and decisive form of power that no emperor could safely ignore, was fading. Frontier generals did not fear the Guard. Provincial armies did not fear the Guard. Even the emperors themselves, increasingly men formed by military experience rather than Roman political culture, related to the Guard as one military unit, among many rather than as the supreme arbiter of imperial succession that it had once been. And then came Diocletian, and then came Constantine, and then came the end, Diocletian, who became emperor in AD 284 after the predictable violent removal of his predecessor, was a man of extraordinary organizational intelligence who looked at the Roman Empire as it existed and understood that it required fundamental restructuring rather than incremental repair. He divided administrative responsibility, created the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, established new imperial capitals closer to the actual frontiers where power now genuinely resided, and systematically reduced the political and military significance of Rome itself. In Diocletian's reformed empire, Rome was a ceremonial capital, a city of historical prestige and symbolic weight. But the actual work of governing and defending the empire happened elsewhere. Nicomedia, Mediolanum, Sirmium, Antioch. The emperor was where the army was, and the army was on the frontiers. In this new geography of power, the Praetorian Guard was an institution without a function. Their reason for existing had been proximity to the emperor. When the emperor was no longer in Rome, that proximity meant nothing. They were 12,000 soldiers in a city that was no longer the center of anything except its own magnificent, melancholy past. It was left to Constantine to deliver the formal verdict. The civil war that brought Constantine to sole power over the empire culminated on October 28, AD 3112, at the Milvian Bridge on the northern outskirts of Rome. His opponent was Maxentius and the Praetorian Guard, or what remained of its coherent institutional identity, fought for Maxentius in that battle. They fought, by the ancient accounts, with the determination of men who understood that they were fighting not merely for a claimant, but for their own survival as an institution, because Constantine had made his intentions regarding the Guard sufficiently clear that no Praetorian could have been in any doubt about what his victory would mean for them. Constantine won. The battle was decisive. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber during the retreat, and the Praetorian Guard that had stood at the center of Roman power for 3.5 centuries passed into history on the banks of that river on an October afternoon. Constantine disbanded them immediately, completely. Finally, the Castra Praetoria, that great barrack city on the Viminal Hill that Sejanus had built as a monument to concentrated Praetorian power, was demolished. The Guard's standards were struck. Its treasury was seized. Its soldiers were distributed among frontier units, scattered across the empire's borders with a deliberateness that precluded any possibility of reconstitution. There would be no rebuilding, no restructuring, no reformed version emerging under a new name. Constantine understood, as Septimius Severus before him had understood but ultimately failed to implement permanently, that the institution itself was the problem. Not its membership, not its commanders, not its pay structure or its internal culture, but the fundamental concept of a permanent, privileged military force stationed in the capital and structurally positioned between the emperor and his power. That concept ended at the Milvian Bridge, 342 years after Augustus had quietly organized his first Praetorian cohorts and distributed them through Rome in civilian clothing, watching and waiting behind their concealed swords. The institution those cohorts had grown into was gone. Rome would survive Constantine by more than a century in the West, and by more than a millennium in the East, but it would never again house the particular institution that had defined, corrupted, protected, and ultimately undermined the Roman imperial experiment more completely than any other single force in its history. The Guardians were gone. The question of who would guard the Guardians had been answered, finally and absolutely, by an emperor willing to simply remove the question entirely. Some problems, it turns out, have only one real solution. Every institution leaves a ghost, not in the supernatural sense, but in the way that powerful human organizations, once they have existed and operated and shaped the world around them, leave behind patterns of behavior, structural vulnerabilities, and cautionary lessons that persist long after the institution itself has ceased to function. The ghost of the Praetorian Guard is one of the most enduring in Western history. It moves through the centuries after Constantine's demolition of the Castra Praetoria with a quiet persistence, appearing in the Byzantine palace guard, in the medieval condottieri, in the janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, in the personal armies of Renaissance princes, in the revolutionary guards of the modern world. Wherever a ruler has created a privileged military force and placed it between himself and the rest of his power structure, the ghost of the Praetorian Guard has been present, whispering the same lesson that Rome learned across 3.5 centuries of increasingly costly experience. The lesson is this: the instrument of protection becomes, inevitably, an instrument of control, and the question of who controls the instrument is always, in the end, the most important political question in any system that contains one. But before we follow that ghost forward through history, we must sit for a moment with what the Guard actually was, in its fullness, beyond the assassinations and the auctions and the concentrated political drama that tends to dominate the historical memory of the institution. Because the Praetorian Guard was not simply a cautionary tale about the dangers of privileged military forces. It was also something genuinely extraordinary, a military institution of remarkable quality, a community of professional soldiers whose skill and dedication represented the absolute apex of what the ancient world could produce in terms of individual warrior excellence. These were men who trained for decades, men who had survived the Roman military's brutal filtering process and emerged at the far end of it, possessing a physical and tactical competence that placed them among the most capable soldiers in human history up to that point. When Marcus Aurelius took Praetorian cohorts north to the Danubian frontier and deployed them against the Marcomanni and the Quadi, they performed with a distinction that even frontier veterans found impressive. When Trajan's campaigns in Dacia pushed into territory that tested the limits of Roman logistics and endurance, the guard cohorts that accompanied him were among the units that the emperor trusted with the most demanding operational assignments. On Trajan's column, that extraordinary spiral narrative of the Dacian campaigns carved in Rome and standing still today, Praetorian soldiers are depicted in the midst of genuine combat, fighting with the disciplined ferocity of men who earned their privileges in blood as well as proximity. The individual Praetorian, considered apart from the institution's political pathologies, was a figure that commanded genuine respect across the ancient world. Roman citizens regarded them with the complicated mixture of pride and apprehension that populations tend to reserve for their most formidable military forces. Rome's enemies, those who had encountered Praetorian cohorts in the field, had no ambivalence about it at all. They were simply the finest heavy infantry in the world, superbly equipped, rigorously trained, and possessed of the particular psychological confidence that comes from knowing, with complete certainty, that you are the best at what you do. That confidence was both the Guard's greatest military asset and the root of its institutional dysfunction. The same certainty of self-worth that made a Praetorian soldier devastatingly effective in combat made the collective Guard an organization that consistently refused to accept the subordinate position that its nominal function required. Bodyguards, by definition, serve. They protect. They subordinate their own judgment and their own interests to those of the person they are charged with protecting. The Praetorian Guard never fully accepted this definition of itself, and Rome paid for that refusal in emperors' lives and decades of political instability across 3 centuries. The legacy of that refusal echoes forward through history with remarkable clarity. The Byzantine Empire, which continued the Roman tradition in the East for 1,000 years after the Western Empire's collapse, never repeated the specific mistake of the Praetorian Guard, but it produced its own variants with depressing regularity. The Varangian Guard, that extraordinary corps of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors from the late 10th century onward, was structured with the explicit lessons of the Praetorian experience partly in mind. Foreign soldiers, deliberately chosen for their cultural distance from Byzantine politics, men who had no local loyalties, no senatorial connections, no stake in the dynastic competitions that consumed the Greek-speaking court. The theory was sound. A guardsman who does not speak your language, who has no family in your city, who owes his entire position to your personal patronage, is a guardsman whose loyalty is more reliably personal than institutional. The theory worked, imperfectly and intermittently, for several centuries, but the Varangian Guard eventually developed its own institutional culture, its own capacity for political interference, its own understanding of what it was worth. The pattern reasserted itself because the pattern was not a product of specifically Roman circumstances. It was a product of the fundamental logic of armed privilege, which operates the same way in Constantinople in the 11th century as it did in Rome in the 1st. The Ottoman Janissaries followed the same trajectory with an almost eerie fidelity to the Praetorian model, created in the 14th century as an elite infantry corps drawn from enslaved Christian boys converted to Islam and trained from childhood as soldiers of the Sultan. They were brilliant, loyal, and militarily formidable for their first several generations of existence. They were also, within 2 centuries of their founding, making and unmaking sultans with a facility that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the history of the Castra Praetoria. By the 19th century, they had become so institutionally entrenched, so resistant to reform, so convinced of their own indispensability, that Sultan Mahmud II found it necessary to destroy them in the same decisive, comprehensive way that Constantine had destroyed the Praetorians, surrounding their barracks with loyal artillery in 1826 and simply killing them, an event the Ottomans called the Auspicious Incident, which is perhaps the most diplomatically named massacre in military history. The parallel is not coincidental, it is structural. The conditions that produced the Praetorian Guard's dysfunctions are not historically unique to Rome. They are inherent to the concept of the institutionalized personal guard, and they reassert themselves whenever the conditions are recreated. Privilege, proximity to power, collective identity, and the gradual development of an institutional self-interest that diverges from the interests of the ruler. The institution was created to serve. In the modern world, the lesson has been absorbed with varying degrees of completeness by different political systems. Democratic republics have generally found structural solutions to the problem. Civilian oversight of military forces, separation of military and police functions, constitutional prohibitions on the use of military force in domestic politics, that address the Praetorian problem without resolving it entirely, because no structural solution resolves it entirely. The problem is not architectural, it is human. Wherever armed men are given privilege and proximity to power, the question of their ultimate loyalty and the related question of what they might do when their interests diverge from their principles is never finally settled. It is only managed, with varying degrees of success, by the quality of the institutions and the judgment of the individuals involved. Authoritarian systems have historically managed it worse, for the obvious reason that the concentration of power that defines authoritarianism recreates the Praetorian conditions almost automatically. The Revolutionary Guards and special security services of 20th century dictatorships, the SS in Nazi Germany, the NKVD in Stalinist Russia, the various Republican Guards and special forces that surrounded the strongmen of the Middle East and Africa, all exhibited, in their own specific cultural contexts, the fundamental dynamics that the Roman Praetorian Guard had exhibited 2,000 years earlier. They accumulated privilege. They developed institutional identities separate from the broader military. They became stakeholders in the survival of the regime rather than servants of the ruler. And the distinction between those two things, which sounds subtle, is in practice the difference between a loyal bodyguard and a political faction that happens to carry weapons. Several of those 20th century strongmen died when their privileged guards decided, for reasons of institutional self-interest or factional politics, that a different arrangement would be preferable. Others survived by managing their guards with the exhausting vigilance that the smarter Roman emperors had brought to the same problem, distributing patronage carefully, preventing any single commander from accumulating too much personal loyalty, maintaining competing factions whose mutual suspicion served as a check on collective action. Tiberius against Sejanus, played out again and again in different costumes across different centuries. What does it mean, finally, that this pattern has proven so persistent, that the specific institutional failure embodied by the Praetorian Guard has reasserted itself so reliably across such vast differences of culture, geography, and historical circumstance? It means, perhaps, that the problem the Guard represents is not a problem of Roman particularity, but a problem of power itself. Power requires protection. Protection requires armed men. Armed men develop interests. Interests eventually diverge. This sequence is not a corruption of the original intention. It is, given enough time and the right conditions, almost the inevitable development of it. The Praetorian Guard was not a mistake that a cleverer Augustus could have avoided by making different institutional choices at the beginning. It was the working out, over 3.5 centuries, of a fundamental tension embedded in the concept of personal military protection at the level of supreme political authority. Augustus understood this tension dimly when he distributed his first cohort through Rome in civilian clothing and appointed 2 prefects to watch each other. Every subsequent emperor who survived long enough to develop a sophisticated relationship with the Guard understood some version of it. Constantine understood it clearly enough to eliminate the institution rather than attempt another reformation. None of them found a permanent solution, because permanent solutions to this particular problem do not exist. What exists is management, vigilance, and the periodic willingness to make painful and decisive choices before the institution's internal momentum makes those choices impossible. The Praetorian Guard stood watch for 342 years. In that time, they protected emperors faithfully and murdered them casually. They fought Rome's enemies with ferocity and sold Rome's throne with equanimity. They were the finest soldiers in the world and the most corrosive institutional force in Roman political life. They were, in their complexity and their contradictions, a perfect mirror of the empire they served, magnificent and flawed in almost exactly equal measure, capable of extraordinary things and terrible ones, shaped by the same forces of ambition and self-interest and proximity to power that shape every human institution ever created. They are gone now. The Castra Praetoria is gone, its stones long since recycled into the medieval and Renaissance city that grew over and around and through the bones of ancient Rome. The eagles are gone. The white and gold uniforms are gone. The scorpion standards and the thunderbolt shields and the long spather swords are in museums and private collections, and the careful reconstructions of scholars who have spent careers trying to understand exactly what these men were. But the question they embodied has not gone anywhere. It stands, as it has always stood, just inside every door where power lives, and armed men watch. Patient, permanent, unanswered. Who guards the guardians? Rome spent 3 centuries learning that no one does. Not forever, not completely, not without cost. We are still learning the same thing.